Pull into any Vauxhall dealer forecourt in 1976, and the Chevette would not have stopped your stride. It sat there with the quiet resignation of sensible footwear, a small, upright, thoroughly reasonable family hatchback that asked nothing more of you than to get in, turn the key, and go. 3 doors. A boot large enough for the weekly shop. A 1.3-litre engine that would never embarrass anyone. It was, by any fair measure, the kind of car that disappears from memory the moment you step out of it. And then, in the winter of 1980, somewhere on a gravel Welsh forest stage, with the rain coming in sideways and the temperature barely above freezing, a Vauxhall Chevette beat the best rally cars in the world to win the RAC Rally of Great Britain. Think about that for a moment. The same nameplate that said school run to the commuters of Coventry was now saying something entirely different to the works teams of Ford and Fiat. The car that nobody noticed had just beaten everybody. How did that happen? The answer involves a ferociously dedicated motorsport operation running on conviction as much as budget, a 2.3-litre 16-valve engine that had no business living under the bonnet of a grocery getter, and a series of decisions that turned one of Britain's most forgettable cars into one of its most improbable motorsport heroes. Britain in 1975 was not feeling particularly heroic. The hangover from the 1973 oil crisis was still pounding behind the country's eyes. Inflation was running above 25%. Harold Wilson had just returned to Downing Street for his second stint. Margaret Thatcher was about to become Conservative Party leader, a detail that tells you everything about the mood. A gallon of 4-star was approaching 40 pence, cheap by any future measure, but a genuine shock after the era of abundant cheap fuel. People were buying smaller, more economical cars because the alternative was not a credible option for most of them. Into this landscape came a small car designed above all else to be affordable and practical. But there is one detail about what this machine eventually became that almost no one outside Britain fully appreciates, and we are going to get to it. Section 1. The Everyday Chevette. Britain's sensible hatchback. To understand what made the Chevette's motorsport story remarkable, you first need to understand how genuinely ordinary the standard car was, and why that was, by design, exactly the point. The Vauxhall Chevette was not conceived in Luton. It was conceived in Detroit as part of General Motors' T-Car program, a global platform strategy that produced the same fundamental vehicle under different badges in different markets around the world. The Opel Kadett C in Germany, the Holden Gemini in Australia, the Isuzu Gemini in Japan, the Chevrolet Chevette in North America. In Britain, it wore the Vauxhall badge and the Chevette name, and it went on sale in the spring of 1975. The brief was straightforward. Vauxhall needed a competitor for the Ford Escort, a car that was by then so thoroughly embedded in British motoring life that it effectively defined the class. The Escort had practicality, reliability, an extensive dealer network, and a motorsport heritage that gave it aspirational credibility even in its most basic trim levels. Vauxhall wanted a piece of that market, and the T-Car platform was their answer. What they delivered was a well-proportioned 3-door hatchback with a fastback roofline that was, in 1975, still considered a relatively modern body style in Britain. The Mark I Golf had only appeared the previous year. The hatchback format was winning the argument over the traditional boot, and Vauxhall had timed their entry reasonably well. The rear hatch and a usable load floor meant the Chevette genuinely worked as a family tool, more versatile in daily use than a conventional saloon of the same size. Under the bonnet sat Vauxhall's 1,256 cubic centimeters overhead valve four-cylinder engine. It was not a thoroughbred. It produced enough power to cover the motorway journey without drama, delivered reasonable economy when treated with some consideration, and asked very little of its owner in terms of mechanical sympathy. It was the automotive equivalent of a reliable appliance, which, in 1975, Britain was precisely what a substantial portion of the buying public needed and wanted. A saloon version and an estate followed, broadening the range and the appeal across different buyer types. The estate, in particular, earned genuine affection from buyers who needed real load-carrying ability in something smaller and more economical than a Vauxhall Cavalier or Ford Cortina. The Chevette estate was not glamorous in the slightest. It was useful, and that mattered more. The press reception was measured but fair. Autocar and motor, the two pillars of British automotive journalism at the time, received the Chevette without great enthusiasm, but acknowledged honestly what it did well. It rode reasonably, it handled predictably and without drama. It offered value that stacked up against the Escort honestly enough that buyers had a genuine choice. No one pretended it was exciting, nobody expected them to. And that, for the first few years of its life, was the story of the Vauxhall Chevette. Competent, affordable, entirely unthreatening. It sold in solid numbers to buyers who valued practicality above prestige and who kept their cars long enough to understand them properly. In the showrooms, it did exactly what Vauxhall needed it to do. Nobody, looking at one of those early cars on the forecourt in 1975, would have written the word Rally next to it. That would take a different kind of ambition, a different engine, and a very different brief. Section 2, Bill Blydenstine, and the decision to race. Before there was a Chevette HS, before there was a factory rally program of any kind, there was Bill Blydenstine. And before you can understand what the HS became, you need to understand who Blydenstine was and what dealer team Vauxhall represented to British motorsport. Blydenstine was a Dutch-born engineer who had been extracting performance from Vauxhall products since the early 1960s. Long before factory backing arrived in any meaningful form, long before the budgets that would eventually make the HS possible. His operation, known as Dealer Team Vauxhall or DTV, had built a reputation across British saloon car racing and rallying for doing more with less than most people thought possible. He had done it with the Firenze in touring car racing. He had developed the Magnum into something competitive that the factory configuration had never promised. By the mid-1970s, when the T-car platform was sitting in the Vauxhall range, Blydenstine and certain people within Vauxhall management had begun asking a serious question. Could the Chevette be made to compete at the top level of international rallying? The World Rally Championship in the mid to late 1970s was entering what many historians of the sport consider its most compelling era. Group 4 regulations governed the top class of competition, and the cars it produced were formidable. Ford were there with the Escort RS 1800, a car with both the pedigree and the results to make other manufacturers take notice. Fiat were competitive. Lancia were building toward what would become a period of dominance. The question for Vauxhall was not whether rallying offered commercial prestige. It clearly did, and the Escort sales halo proved it. The question was whether a program serious enough to produce genuine results could be assembled. Group 4 homologation regulations required manufacturers to build a minimum number of road-going cars based on the competition machine before it could be certified for international competition. This was the rule that bridged the showroom and the forest stage, the mechanism that kept world rallying theoretically connected to production vehicles rather than becoming a pure prototype series. To satisfy homologation requirements, Vauxhall would need to build a genuine production run of road cars, sharing the essential technical characteristics of the rally machine. The decision was made in the mid-1970s, with the car reaching the public in 1978. Vauxhall would develop a high-performance variant of the Chevette, specifically to meet homologation requirements, and that variant would be sold to the public. The result was called the Chevette HS, the initials standing for high speed, though the designation high performance also appears in period literature. And at this distance, the precise official interpretation matters less than what the car itself delivered. The engineering challenge was real. The T-car's standard underpinnings, entirely adequate for a family hatchback, never intended for anything more demanding, required significant development work. The brakes needed attention, the suspension geometry needed revisiting, the body structure needed stiffening to handle the demands that serious competition would place on it. But the central challenge, the one that would define whether the program had any credibility at all, was the engine. The standard 1,256 cubic centimeters unit was not going to compete on a gravel stage against the Ford Escort RS 1800. A new power plant was required, and it had to be something that the homologation rules would accept as a genuine production component. Section 3, the Chevette. HS, what they actually built. The Chevette HS went on public sale in 1978, and to look at one on the road today is to experience a particular kind of cognitive dissonance. The body is recognizably a Chevette. The same glass house, the same profile, the same fundamental shape that had been making unremarkable progress around Britain's suburbs for 3 years. But look more carefully and the differences begin to accumulate. The HS sat lower on its suspension. It wore wider wheels beneath subtly flared arches that broke the standard car's plain flanks just enough to suggest that something different was going on underneath the skin. A small rear spoiler interrupted the roofline in a way that, on any standard Chevette, would have looked faintly absurd. Here, it looked purposeful. The interior was uprated appropriately. Better seats that held the driver in place under cornering load, a more considered finish throughout. But the HS was fundamentally a driver's car rather than a luxury one. The point was never comfort. The point was always the engine. The 2.3-litre four-cylinder unit fitted to the HS was equipped with a 16-valve twin-cam cylinder head, a specification that, for a mass-market British hatchback in 1978, was genuinely extraordinary. For context, this was a level of engine sophistication that in the same year you would more readily have associated with a Ferrari or a Lotus than a car designed primarily to carry shopping and children. In road-going specification, the unit produced approximately 135 brake horsepower. That figure demands its own moment of historical context. In 1978, 135 horsepower from a production four-cylinder hatchback was a meaningful achievement. The Ford Escort RS 2000 of the period, the acknowledged benchmark of the hot hatchback class, produced around 100 brake horsepower. The HS had a significant advantage over it in a car that to the casual observer looked almost identical to the stripped economy model in the next parking space. The performance reflected this. Period road tests recorded 0 to 60 times in approximately 8 seconds and a top speed approaching 115 miles per hour. For 1978, for this type of car, those numbers were serious. What struck testers equally was the character the engine brought, a willingness to rev cleanly and a mechanical presence that the 16-valve specification delivered in a way that the standard car's agricultural overhead valve unit could not approach. For homologation purposes, the production run of the HS stood at approximately 400 examples, the minimum required number under Group 4 regulations, assembled with the kind of care and precision that a car produced for this specific regulatory purpose demands rather than a car produced for volume sales. These were not mainstream production vehicles. They were built deliberately, sold at a price substantially above the standard Chevettes, and purchased predominantly by buyers who understood exactly what they were acquiring and precisely why. A meaningful proportion went directly to private rally competitors who intended to use the car for exactly the purpose that had motivated its creation. Others went to road enthusiasts who wanted the most serious Chevette that Vauxhall would sell them. In either case, the HS was never a car for the casual showroom browser. For the factory program, however, the road car was only the foundation. The vehicle that would actually line up on the stages of the RAC Rally was a further development, designated the HSR, and the distance between the two machines was substantial enough that calling the HSR a modified HS gently understates the transformation that had taken place. Section 4. The HSR and the RAC Rally. If the HS was a homologation special with genuine road manners, the HSR was what happened when dealer team Vauxhall took those homologation papers to the workshop and built the car they had actually been designing toward all along. The HSR retained the fundamental architecture of the HS, the same shell, the same basic engine family, the same configuration that the homologation rules required, but was transformed in almost every detail that mattered for competition. The body shell was extensively stiffened. The suspension was rebuilt around the specific demands of gravel stages, snow-covered forest roads, and the mixed surface events that the RAC Rally was famous for delivering in a single weekend. The engine, already impressive in road specification, was taken significantly further in competition tune. Power figures varied as the program developed, and as different specification levels were prepared for different events, but the transformation from the road car was considerable. This was an engine operating well beyond the constraints that road legality and everyday reliability had placed on the HS unit. The exterior changed in ways that made the competitive intent unmistakable, even if the roofline still said Chevette to anyone watching from a stage bank. Wider wheel arch extensions accommodated the broader, more aggressive tyres demanded by high-speed gravel running. A pronounced front spoiler and rear aerofoil completed a visual character that was, by the standards of British rally cars in the late 1970s, properly aggressive. The incongruity, the ordinary outline carrying extraordinary equipment, became part of the car's identity and, in time, part of its appeal. The driver lineup that DTV assembled for the program was serious by any measure. Tony Pond, one of the genuinely gifted British rally drivers of his generation, a man whose car control on loose surfaces was the kind that made experienced observers stop and watch, was central to what DTV built. Pentti Eerikala, the Finnish driver, whose commitment on gravel stages was the kind that encouraged spectators to take several steps back from the tape, brought a different set of qualities to the team. Eerikala had the attacking precision on gravel that the RAC Rally demanded, and his reading of stage conditions was exceptional. The RAC Rally of Great Britain, run each November through the forests of Wales, Scotland and England, was by the late 1970s one of the defining events on the World Rally calendar. It was notorious for its conditions and its character. Stage temperatures that could drop below freezing, surfaces that could transform from packed gravel to mud to standing water in the space of a single stage, and a competitive field that drew the best drivers and manufacturers in the world to what was, in all fairness, one of the most demanding events on the calendar. Winning it meant something concrete. It was not a peripheral event. In 1980, Pentti Arikkala drove a Vauxhall Chevette HSR to overall victory at the RAC Rally. The car that Vauxhall had launched 5 years earlier as Britain's sensible everyday hatchback, the car designed to compete with the Ford Escort in the school run and weekend shop market, had beaten the world's best on home ground. The reaction in Britain was one of genuine delight, not the manufactured enthusiasm of a corporate press release, but the authentic pleasure that comes from watching something unexpected and earned succeed against credible opposition. Tony Pond also delivered strong competitive results for DTV across the broader programme, and the combination of the two drivers gave Vauxhall a presence in international rallying that, a decade earlier, would have been difficult to imagine attaching to any car wearing the Luton badge. Remember what I said at the beginning, that there was something about this car that almost no one outside Britain fully appreciates? This is it. Not just that it won, but that it won in a car that the general public, at the time, associated with school runs and supermarket car parks. The gap between perception and reality for the Chevette HSR was as wide as it has ever been for any British competition car. The Vauxhall Chevette ended its production run in 1984. In the showrooms, it went as quietly as it had always lived, replaced by the Vauxhall Astra, a more sophisticated machine for a more sophisticated decade. The families who had bought the standard Chevette moved on without much ceremony, and the new car served them well. But the story of what the Chevette became says something worth sitting with for a moment after the video is over. The 1970s were not an easy decade to be an ambitious engineer at a British volume manufacturer. Budgets were constrained by economic conditions that were genuinely severe. The broader industrial climate was difficult in ways that anyone who lived through it does not need explained. The decision to build the HS, to spend serious engineering resource on a 16-valve four-cylinder for a car whose body panels were shared with a vehicle most people were buying precisely because it was inexpensive and undemanding, required a quality of conviction that the decade did not always reward or celebrate. That conviction produced a RAC Rally win. It produced a small, carefully assembled homologation special that today commands genuine attention from collectors and historians who understand what they are looking at. A well-preserved Chevette HS in original, unmodified condition is no longer the car that disappears from memory. It is the car that people gather around at concours events and classic shows, the car whose story takes longer to tell than its exterior would suggest, the car whose arches and spoiler are now read correctly as the signatures of a serious engineering exercise. The HSR continues to be recognized as one of the more unlikely and therefore more satisfying chapters in British motorsport history. It came from a platform that offered nothing obvious in the direction of competition glory. It was built by people who believed the platform could be made to do something it had never been asked to do. And it succeeded, not because it was the biggest budget or the most famous name, but because the work was done properly by people who cared about the result. There is something in that story that feels entirely worth remembering. Now it is your turn. Did you own a Chevette? Standard trim, HS, or anything in between? Did you watch the HSR on a stage in person? Or listen to it on the radio? Did your father have one? And does that bring back anything you would rather it did not? I would genuinely like to know. Leave a comment below with what you remember. Because the people watching this video carry knowledge about these cars that no published account has properly recorded. If this brought something back or showed you something you did not know, A like and a subscription would mean a great deal. We make these videos for people who take this history seriously, and you clearly do. Thank you for watching.